Welcome everyone. My name is Ro Johnstone-Hulse. I am Government Affairs Lead at NCC Group, and I am delighted to be navigating us all through the next 45 minutes or so, where we'll be exploring the ever more complex world of cyber policy and cyber regulations. I think most of you will be aware who NCC Group is, but if you are not, NCC Group is a people-powered, tech-enabled, full-spectrum cybersecurity services provider. We could cover the full life cycle of cyber services, and we do that globally. And it's through that global footprint that we get to see and compare the evolving cyber regulatory landscape around the world, not least because we get to play an active role in shaping a lot of the laws and the policies that underpin the regulatory decision making that is happening across our core jurisdictions. So we're really excited to share some of the insights that we get from that engagement with you all today as we enter into 2026, can you believe it, and think about our big predictions for the year ahead. But before we do that, we thought it would be fun to quickly assess how good our crystal ball gazing skills really are by looking at the predictions that we made for 2025 this time last year when we carried out a very similar webinar. So jumping straight in, the first prediction that we made for 2025 was that government's revised view of cybersecurity responsibility will begin to have real-world impacts on the actions of organisations and individuals. And I guess, as is my prerogative as chair, I can rate myself or ourselves, and I'm going to rate us out of 10 for each of the predictions, and I'm going to be generous, and I think I'm going to give us an 8.5 or a 10 for this particular prediction, not least because of the conversations that we're having with our clients and organisations that we work with who are really ramping up their respective investments and programmes on compliance. But equally, we have some proper data to back it up. So the European Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA, published its latest survey of NIS2 regulated organisations in the last week or so, and it found that some 70% of those organisations, so a good majority, identified that regulatory compliance with NIS2, DORA, the Cyber Resilience Act, and other key European regulations are collectively the main driver for cybersecurity investment over the past year. So I think we've done pretty well on the first prediction. Our second prediction was that more incidents than ever before will be reported to regulatory authorities. I'm going to be slightly harsher here and say we're probably at about a 7.5/8, not least because I couldn't find any data to back this up ahead of time. But whilst I imagine it's probably true, I would imagine because of the way in which the regulations are strengthening around the types of incidents that need to be reported, and also because of the evolving threat landscape that we have seen an uptick. We are also at a stage where many of the frameworks that we expected and expect to drive this uptake in the number of incidents that need to be reported to regulators are still being implemented or developed in some way. So whether that's the European Union's NIS2 directive continuing to be transposed by member states, or the UK Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, which has only very recently been introduced to Parliament, or whether it's kind of Canada's equivalent legislation around critical infrastructure being reintroduced to Parliament following their election earlier this year. So I think we'll continue to see a tightening of incident reporting rules, and there will be kind of new rules coming up around things like ransomware reporting in the UK, for example. But in terms of for this year, I'd say, yeah, good 7.5 or 8 for prediction number 2. And our third and final prediction for 2025 was that developers and users of AI will face very different safety and security rules depending on where they are in the world. And I shall end on a strong note and give us a big fat 10 out of 10, but not least because I really do think that we have seen 3 distinct approaches to AI regulation emerge in the last year. Whether you have the European Union's AI Act on the one hand, which whilst it is being delayed in its implementation, will still introduce pretty stringent rules for developers and deployers of AI. On the other end of the spectrum, you of course have the US federal government, who is seeking to liberalise AI rules and perhaps supersede some of the state government activity that's taking place in the states. But equally, we've got the likes of UK, Australia falling somewhere in the middle, and both of them actually recently announcing that they're kind of abandoning previously announced plans for an AI standalone piece of legislation and using existing regulations to put safeguards in place around AI development and deployment. So I would say we've done pretty well for 2025, and I hope that that instills some confidence in the 2026 predictions that we're about to share with you all. But to debate and discuss whether they are indeed accurate predictions, I am delighted to be joined by two brilliant panelists. We have Kevin Reithet from Microsoft, who is the Director of Cybersecurity Policy there and also an advisor to the firm's Quantum Safe program. And we also have our very own Christo Butcher, a strategic consultant at Fox IT, who supports organisations globally with their cyber and compliance journeys. That leads us very neatly on to our first prediction, which will hopefully provide reassurance to the, how's my maths? Nearly 80% of you that answered either yes or somewhat to the polling question. And so our prediction is that governments and regulators will go against their nature to reduce administrative overheads, making it easier for you all to complete, to meet compliance obligations and allow you to invest more in your security posture. So some potentially good news. And why have we made that prediction? Well, globally, economic pressures, limited public sector budgets are driving governments to be more creative about how they enable innovation and deliver growth. And reducing regulatory burdens is really very much a part of that. And a lot of governments have set targets about the number of regulations that they want to reduce by. There has also been some recognition across cyber policymakers and rule makers that the last 7-8 years of rulemaking within the cybersecurity space has resulted in a pretty complex and often overlapping set of laws and regulations. And so there is room to potentially harmonise, simplify, align some of these rules. And we're seeing that play out in a variety of different policies. So, for example, we've got the European Union looking to implement a single reporting platform where essentially if you need to report an incident under DORA, NIS2, GDPR, Cyber Resilience Act, sector-specific regulations, you only have to go to a one place in order to report that particular incident. And we've seen a similar initiative announced in Australia. In the US, the forthcoming National Cybersecurity Strategy is expected to include something around how at a federal level they're planning to kind of simplify and align some cyber rules. And equally, at a global level, we're seeing an increasing trend of frameworks and agreements between different countries to use the same standards to underpin their respective legal frameworks. So the most recent example of that is an agreement between Singapore, Japan, the UK, Australia, several European member states like Germany, to use ETSI 303-645 to underpin consumer IoT standards within their respective legal frameworks. So some pretty hopefully positive news there. But I guess I'll come to you first, Christo, if I may. How optimistic are you about government's efforts to streamline these rules and harmonise regulations? In your experience, do you think it's really possible for regulators to go against their true nature and avoid ever more rulemaking?
I definitely think it's an important direction to move in. I guess the poll results showed that many people see that way. And thankfully, in my contact with regulators and the people behind these policies, I definitely do see a clear awareness of the need to streamline and simplify regulations. So that in itself is a positive sign. The intention, the motivation, they really are there. At the same time, I think it's important to be realistic. Regulation, compliance, it inevitably creates some operational overhead. So completely removing that burden is unrealistic. But the encouraging part is that the people working behind the scenes do recognize this issue. They're actively looking for ways to improve the situation within what's possible to them. So cautiously optimistic, not because it's easy, but because the right mindset is there behind the scenes.
That's a really interesting point, I think. And from your perspective, are you seeing that mindset being reflected on both sides? So from the regulator side, but also the organizations that you work with? Because I think ultimately, if we want to create good regulation, we need to ensure that both the regulators and the regulated are speaking to each other, and that there is a feedback loop about how regulations are impacting frontline kind of cybersecurity operations. So yeah, what's your kind of experience of the relationship between regulators and regulated entities, and also the preparedness on both sides to engage?
Very interesting point, Ro, because what I think, again, is a good sign here is that on the side of the regulators, cybersecurity is recognized as a relatively new, fast-moving, dynamic field, which sort of helps them understand that the best way to move forward is to collaborate with the organizations they regulate. And that is a shift away from the traditional auditor posture, where non-compliance means punishment afterwards, et cetera. There's more of that openness from the regulatory side to talk with organizations. Of course, they are looking for the right balance. Regulators need to maintain their independence, the trust society places in them. So combining that openness, collaborative way of moving forward with their independence, something where they're looking for the balance. But I do see that as a move in the right direction towards more collaborative shaping. From the side of organizations, it varies very much, in large part due to the maturity of organizations. So some organizations are proactive. They want to help regulators. They're willing to actually, be very open about the challenges they face and the gap they see between compliance, regulatory overhead, and what they feel really matters, the real challenges in security. But there are many organizations, a lot of them less mature, that do take the posture of waiting for clarity, hoping that regulators will tell them what to do, or within the sector, some kind of guidance will take shape so that they can basically follow along. And I believe that uneven engagement is, of course, a challenge, again, for regulators to make sure they get a good full overview and don't listen to only the more mature organizations, but get a well-balanced situation there. So both sides, I see, a positive movement, but at the same time, that dynamic does show how complex this challenge is.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Kevin, if I come to you next, what's the kind of US perspective on this debate? Are you seeing the kind of regulation skeptic view driving great efficiencies in regulations, or is there a danger that we'll go even further and see cyber regulations abandoned altogether? For example, the FCC recently announcing that there'll be some watering down or reversal of some of the telecoms regulations. Yeah, it'd be great to get the kind of US perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what's happening in the US right now, I kind of expect maybe a mixture of both of those things. And I think it really is going to be situationally dependent. The National Cyber Director here in the US has definitely emphasized in some of his early speeches and remarks that regulatory alignment and reducing burdens is a focus for this administration. You mentioned the rollback of the FCC regulations on telecoms. We've also heard some rumblings about potentially rolling back the SEC incident reporting obligations in favor of kind of aligning behind the CISA regulations or the incident reporting regulations that CISA is due to finalize next year. So I think that might be one way in which certain companies will still have to report, but maybe it will, instead of being two different reporting mechanisms, maybe it'll just be one reporting mechanism in the US going forward. So I think it's going to be situationally dependent. I think one thing to watch for, and which we haven't seen any changes on, and is on your graphic here, is the TSA regulations in the pipeline sector and others. You know, when the prior administration initially promulgated some of those regulations, there was a lot of opposition in industry to some of the things that they were doing, to the point where I kind of question, when this administration come in, whether they might move quickly to repeal those. But that's not an area where I've heard much discussion about potentially pulling those regulations back. That's not to say it couldn't still happen, but I think the difference between that area and potentially the FCC regulations, where there was a huge debate with FCC regulations as to whether they had the statutory authority to actually be promulgating those regulations. I don't think that same debate necessarily existed within TSA as to the statutory authority as much. So that's a long-winded way of saying is I think depending on the sector, depending on the situation, I think things can change in the US.
Interesting, thank you. And obviously spoke about our 2025 prediction on AI, and we have seen, I would say, a significant slowing down of AI rulemaking in the US and certainly in the UK and the likes of Australia, as I mentioned, abandoning plans to regulate more heavily in that space. What do you think is driving that, and what are your expectations for AI rules in the next year or so and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking particularly at the U.S. perspective, I think it's clear that this administration in the U.S., as well as the Republicans in control of Congress, are more interested in supporting the innovation in AI, and feel that regulation could slow down that innovation. So I think from a security perspective, they're looking to take a light touch within the US from a national perspective. I think from a state level perspective, and this is both on from a Republican and Democratic side, there's different views. And so I do expect to see continuing efforts to legislate and regulate on AI from a state level perspective, which creates its own regulatory disharmony challenges. I think internationally, there's been some rollback, but I haven't seen it to the same extent that we've seen in the US. So I think there's going to continue to be more of a press internationally on these issues. And from a Microsoft perspective, we're openly committed to working with regulators and lawmakers to find sensible regulation laws to ensure that we have the trust of states and citizens to put this technology to increase the productivity of populations across the world and economic competitiveness.
Awesome, thank you. And Christo, from your side, how are you advising organizations and clients to navigate compliance in this space, particularly as kind of Kevin's alluded to, we are seeing potentially different approaches at a state level in the US and differing approaches around the world?
So my advice generally boils down to taking the problem seriously and not waiting for the regulators to tell you what to do. What Kevin said, light touch approach from the US basically opens the playing field. It leaves the choice up to individual organizations how they're going to manage risks related to AI. And what you also said earlier was, within the EU, things have been delayed. We still expect there to be, rules, safeguards coming. We expect the EU to move forward, but it'll just take a while. So until then, very important for organizations to understand the real risks they're running. That risk-based approach seems to be the right way to work with this. Understand how you're using AI, what that means for your business, and then basically solve the problems you face anyway, regardless of regulations. In our experience, that lines organizations up pretty well to when EU regulations come. Could very well be risk-based, then you have in place what you need to show compliance.
Fabulous, awesome. All right, I shall move us on to our second prediction now. And so our second prediction is that the lines of responsible nation state behaviour in cyberspace will be redrawn as governments work with the private sector to enact their offensive cyber strategies. So slightly different area this, and what this really reflects is the kind of ramping up of government rhetoric that we've seen over the course of 2025 when it comes to things like cyber warfare and offensive cyber activity, shifting from a pretty long-standing actually focus around sanctions to developing cyber capabilities in the same way that you would kind of nuclear deterrence, and demonstrating to adversaries that there are severe consequences for their actions in cyberspace. And so some examples of activity include what will be outlined in the forthcoming US National Cybersecurity Strategy, which has really been driven by a kind of significant debate on greater offensive activity in the States. We have seen within the European Union, the Italian Defence Minister published a paper recently calling for the EU to ramp up its offensive cyber activity. And then equally in the UK, the Security Minister telling adversaries that hack Britain and face the consequences, while also seeing organisations like the National Cyber Force launching a publicly facing offensive cyber programme with a think tank called RUSI. Kevin, on the US National Cybersecurity Strategy, which I think we are expecting in the new year, what are some of the practical offensive measures that you're expecting to be announced within that strategy? And do you believe that this strategy and the move of other governments around the world marks a shift in approach?
I mean, I think what we're expecting from a national cyber security strategy here in the US is for it to be pretty high level. So I doubt it will dive into the details, but I do expect it to, at a high level, basically advance the idea that the US should be using offensive cyber actions to deter adversaries more in cyberspace. So I think there is definitely a lean from this administration to do that. I think there were some debates early on in this administration and within Congress as to the role of private sector in that, and should private sector be more involved in offensive cyber activity. And from a Microsoft perspective, we were very concerned about some of the discussions of hackback and some ideas around enabling victims to kind of engage in offensive activity against their perpetrators, creating some sort of Wild West in cyberspace and encouraging companies to do that. I think some of the discussions I've seen more recently seems to have that this administration is not necessarily thinking of increasing offensive cyber activity with the private sector in that way, but more what I've heard recently is the idea that they should be leveraging private sector more to advance their own government authorized or operated operations. So it's not that they'd be encouraging private sector to necessarily act outside the auspices of government activity or government operations, but how do they better utilize the skills and technology within government authorized operations is sort of what I've been hearing in the background. So we'll have to see as it goes forward what this actually looks like and what they advance, but that's more kind of the more recent things I've been hearing. Interesting,
thank you. And do you, I feel like I could spend 8,000 hours talking about the subject because I find it so interesting, but how confident are you around, to your point, around some of the ethical boundaries and safeguards that will be put in place for that sort of activity? Does it, I guess, thinking about things like the Pall Mall process to limit the proliferation of cyber intrusion capabilities, are you do you see that within that discussion there are also discussions around the ethical frameworks that should underpin them?
Well, I think there's definitely discussions around what the proper use of offensive cyber activity is. I think that, I don't have huge concerns in terms of the US, potential US or other like-minded countries doing operations in the near future that would kind of go way outside the bounds of that. I think more what this administration and some others feel is that the West has been more restrained than our adversaries in our willingness to conduct certain types of operations as deterrence capabilities. If you look at things like Bolt Typhoon and the pre-positioning of cyber operations on US critical infrastructure. And that China, in that case, hasn't really faced any kind of deterrent blowback for that. And so I think there's an argument that where the US is restraining itself, or like-minded countries are restraining itself in ways that adversaries aren't. And so I think that what I would expect if they do move forward with this is potentially to use operations as a signaling to adversaries about the capabilities as a way to potentially deter or reach a new kind of understanding of what responsible behavior is.
Awesome, thank you. And Krista, from I guess a threat landscape perspective, do you think some of this activity will change the threat landscape that a lot of organizations are operating within? Should organizations be preparing for full-out cyber warfare? Or, you know, is the changes within the threat landscape likely to be more nuanced than that?
Organizations should definitely take the current geopolitical situation seriously. And one of the reasons why is that there's a fundamental difference between traditional military conflict and the cyber domain. That is proximity, where in that physical world, traditional military conflict, then national defense is largely responsible. Governments, defense departments, they take care of that. There are clear borders. Most organizations are far removed from the front line. Cyberspace, those borders look completely different. So a foreign adversary in cyberspace can reach deep inside society, target organizations directly, bypassing any kind of state-level defenses. So that means that the geopolitical tensions, which might seem far away in the traditional military sense, can be much more close, immediate at the organizational level for individual companies, government departments, etc. So while I wouldn't say organizations need to prepare for cyber warfare in a military sense, I do believe it's very important that they understand that they are part of that broader attack surface of a nation. And that includes the responsibility to take care of themselves, their own resilience, to help make society less susceptible to cyber attacks.
Awesome.
I also wanted to add, Rod, that I think from a Microsoft perspective too, you know, talking about the use of offensive cyber activity, our advocacy has really been focused on that the key to deterrence is it's not cyber against cyber, it's using other aspects of geopolitical power to deter this activity. So while there may be some that are arguing that offensive cyber activity is the key to deterrence, we actually think there's other levers of power that are likely more effective.
Interesting. So things like kind of financial sanctions and.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think generally it's about making this an issue at a national or international level, similar to maybe what you see, whether you agree with it or not, the US doing right now with drugs and the impacts it's having on society. If you could imagine, you know, the president of the US making cyber activity that level of an international issue with our adversaries and pressing them on it, that might be more effective than increasing cyber operations, as an example.
As I say, I would love to talk about this subject for another 20 minutes, but we can't. We must move to our third and final prediction. So our third prediction that we have put forward is that cybersecurity will be placed firmly on boards' agendas because A, regulation will tell them that they have to, and B, the view that investment in cybersecurity is economic security has now really taken hold. So I'd say on the one hand, we are seeing multiple emerging regulatory and policy drivers as governments become much more focused on making senior business leaders accountable. So that's things like EU's NIS2 having specific provisions around senior liability for compliance, but also we're expecting within the UK Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, that there will be provisions around corporate governance within the more detailed security requirements, and that will look at things like the role of boards and the responsibility that boards need to take on. We've seen the Australian financial regulators taking action in courts, and we've also seen, as is shown up on screen, the UK government writing to the chairs and the CEOs of FTSE 350 companies in the UK, essentially calling on them to step up and do more within their kind of respective organisations to invest in cybersecurity. So that kind of regulatory political pressure on the one hand, but also that being driven by the series of high-profile incidents that we've seen with real-world economic impacts, such as the JLR attacks, potentially slowing down UK GDP growth, and this really hammering home to both businesses and policymakers that you can't have a secure and stable business or a secure and stable economy without digital resilience. Christo, over to you. In your work with organisations, are you observing a shift in terms of senior leaders and boards' perceptions of cybersecurity? And if so, do you agree with some of the reasons that we've outlined for this change?
Yes, definitely in my work, I see this shift in how senior leaders perceive cybersecurity. Regulations do play a significant role. Making leaders explicitly liable does put the topic on the agenda. That's led to a lot of questions of how to take a complex area like cybersecurity and really get a grip to be able to take responsibility, be accountable for how a big organization does it. That a lot of questions we get there. But at the same time, regulation is only one factor. The broader mindset around cyber threats has also changed over the last years. So a couple of years ago, some leadership teams might see cybersecurity, see the threats, might be aware of them, but they were still hoping that it would fade away as security technology matured, or that they could delegate it to an IT department. That mindset has changed, and leadership has increasingly accepted that cyber risks are a persistent part of the world we operate in. And that leads to them really, more and more wanting to take responsibility to ensure that their organizations are in control. So I agree with the reasons you mentioned. Regulations are an important part driving this, but also just the fact that organizations more and more accept the world we live in, that taking a risk-based approach is the right way to move forward.
And Kevin, from your engagement with policymakers, have you kind of seen a shift in the role that they see senior business leaders taking when it comes to cybersecurity? Are they seeing that actually that those business leaders, whether they're kind of CEOs, whether they're the chairs of boards, whether they other roles within businesses, that they need to do more in order to invest in their own cyber resilience?
I think there's still a demand for more attention from senior leadership in businesses, and I think it varies depending on the policymaker how much they want that. I think there is a perception that it's being taken more seriously. I think regulation is a part of that, but I also think there's a huge part of that's been kind of the impacts that we've seen in the private sector from ransomware. And from other activities that have been occurring for multiple years now. And I think that, those things have had real business impacts and economic costs in so many sectors now, that it's really, I think, focused the attention of senior leadership on the importance of cybersecurity in ways that, lawmakers or policymakers talking to them maybe had minimal effects before. So I think that is a big driver of this, in addition to the regulation and other things that we've been seeing as well.
Awesome. It would be remiss of me to not talk about your role on Microsoft's Quantum Safe program, not least because we're hearing a lot about the transition to post-quantum crypto at the moment. So we ran a LinkedIn poll ahead of this session, which found that 38% of organizations feel they need further guidance in their transition to PQC, while an additional 31% stated that they needed greater resources. Do you think this kind of emphasis on senior accountability for cybersecurity makes you kind of more or less optimistic that the necessary steps to transition to a post-quantum world will be taken?
Well, I think the quantum safe transition is a uniquely challenging area. I think it is definitely helpful, but one of the biggest challenges with the transition to quantum safety is it is more of a kind of long-term, at least in the minds of many leaders, it's kind of a long-term threat as compared to the threats that many organizations feel they have to deal with now. So I think what a lot of people within organizations who are trying to make this transition happen struggle with is advising senior leaders as how to prioritize investment in the quantum safe transition as opposed to many of the other options or strategies they need to employ to become or to improve their cybersecurity. So the short answer is yes. I think having senior leadership involved is definitely helpful because they're going to be the ones that can drive resources and drive decisions to prioritize this. But it does not fix the still challenging environment that all organizations face in terms of limited resources, time, and attention, and having to prioritize which things to do now versus which things to wait a little bit longer on.
Awesome. Thank you both. So I think we have some time now to take some of the questions that have been trickling in. I'm going to start with the question from Daniel Dresner, which is around how we might promote regulation as a route to innovation. So really looking at the way in which ways to offer good, safe online products and services that comply should actually, whet the appetite of innovators rather than it have them shake their entrepreneurial heads in disgust. But I think this is a real kind of interesting area, and I think it's one that we have consistently struggled with in the world of cybersecurity, is to make the case of cybersecurity as an enabler of economic growth and innovation. But it does feel like that narrative is starting to change. I don't know, Krista, if I come to you first, from your perspective, are you seeing that narrative taking hold with your clients and that recognition of growth and innovation and cybersecurity being an essential enabler of that?
Yes, partially, because it being an enabler for a lot of organizations that deliver to end users or consumers or business to business type relationships, whether it's an enabler or not depends in large part whether their customers are sensitive to it. And we come from a world where cybersecurity think of the average IoT device where security often is really an afterthought. We come from a world where security was just not something that was important when customers decided whether they were going to spend a little bit more for a higher quality product or one with better security. That, I believe, is where the driver has to come from. So in some markets, clients that operate in those markets where the people making purchasing decisions actually care about security, there it really is becoming visible that doing cybersecurity right gives you a competitive advantage. But not all markets work that way yet. So I believe that's the right way to get that feedback loop to work well.
So Kevin, anything you'd add to this particular discussion?
I really like the question and how it's framed. I think in some ways there is a class of entrepreneurs who always see or potentially see regulations as innovation. It comes to mind in the U.S. financial sector after the terrorist attacks in 2001. There were a lot of regulations put on the financial sector in terms of know your customer. And there were a whole lot of companies that started trying to create solutions for solving the challenge of how do you authenticate customer identities and helping banks do that. So I think that is a pattern I see across the different things is as some of these regulations happen, you often get companies, but the challenge in terms of selling that message is generally those are small companies whose voices aren't the loudest, right? it's the regulations challenging the bigger companies, where they're going to have roadblocks that are often the loudest in the moment. But I think that's something we can do more of, is highlighting the opportunities that exist when these things happen.
So thank you both. It feels quite optimistic, doesn't it? We have a question from Bob Burton, which is how businesses should prepare for the UK Cyber Resilience Bill, whether it's the same as NIS2. I guess as the resident Brit on this call, I will quickly take this question. So essentially, it is very similar, but there are differences between the way in which the UK government's looking to update its NIS regulations, Bob, versus the way the European Union's gone about it. Principally, there are slightly different sectors that will be regulated under the CSRB in the UK versus NIS2 in the EU. So firstly, understanding whether you are in scope. So it's going to, for example, extend regulations to managed service providers, energy flexibility providers, critical suppliers, and also data centers. So understanding whether you fit within those legal definitions will be important. The other thing to note is that the security requirements that underpin those regulations within the UK are going to be consulted on next year. So to Christo's earlier point about engaging with your regulators, engaging with government, highly recommend that you engage with that process and ensure that your voice is being heard if you are going to be subject to those rules. But equally, that shouldn't stop you from preparing for compliance now, because we do know that the underpinning security requirements are likely going to be a mix of the cyber assessment framework that's been in place for many, many years in the UK, and also the cyber governance code of practice, potentially with some other bits and pieces in there. But as a kind of starter for 10, working within that code of practice and also within the cyber assessment framework as your starting point for kind of understanding whether your organisation would be my best advice for businesses at this stage of the bill process. We've had a question from Graham, which is around the kind of reduction in public sector resources in the US and kind of staffing reductions in CISA. Do you kind of, I'll come to you, Kevin, if I may. Do you see any kind of knock-on impact in terms of the ability for kind of CISA to play a role within the current cyber landscape that we're operating in, and I guess potentially through things like international initiatives like the counter ransomware initiative?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the impacts to CISA, they've definitely had a huge reduction in staff since the start of the Trump administration. So I think it definitely decreases the scale of activities that they can engage in. So we do still see them very active in partnering with companies to counter threats. We belong to the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative with CISA as an example, and communicate quite regularly with them in terms of things that we're seeing and getting information from them. So, but I think, they have definitely reduced some of their activities. Another prime example is the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, which was disbanded early on in the Trump administration. We are hearing that they plan to reinstitute that public-private partnership, but haven't seen that yet. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think we're going to continue to see CISA playing a role, but the reality is with their reduced staffing and other things that it's going to be on less of a scale, but they'll still be an important player.
Thank you. We have time for one more question before we wrap up, which is, and I'd be really keen to get both your views on this, from Sue. So maybe Christo, I'll come to you first. How worried should we be about the digital sovereignty agenda? And I guess if I was to expand on that, that's obviously playing out in a number of roles in terms of technology sovereignty, data sovereignty, but also kind of broader cybersecurity sovereignty as well. So how are you seeing that play out, Christo, within your kind of main area of work?
So I'd say that is a perfect example of what Kevin said earlier about how regulation or how some external force can drive innovation. Within Europe, this definitely is a field where a lot of organizations feel there are no ready-to-go off-the-shelf solutions for dealing with this. A lot of organizations I speak with are thinking about it, but they're really struggling with a market that does not give them a lot of options there. So I believe that is why it's a good example of what Kevin said earlier. For the right people at the right time, jumping on an opportunity like this and working towards there being solutions. Currently, that is, the market just isn't there yet for organizations that sort of want a ready-to-go solution. So I think as a society at that level, European market, that's where most of the activity is going to be the coming period. And I do sort of understand Sue's use of the word worried. That does place a lot of organizations in a situation where they might feel like they want to make a decision, take steps, but they just don't see enough real practical, usable options to move in that direction. So I very much understand that feeling. And I hope that will result in, the right market forces helping all of us together move forward. But, so yeah, very, very relevant, but also very challenging.
Yeah, and I just, add from a Microsoft perspective, it's definitely something that, we hear a lot when engaging, particularly in Europe, other places. And on the innovation point, I mean, we've put into place a number of capabilities and programs trying to address those concerns at various levels from policy on down. And in the EU context, we had our digital commitments to Europe, including helping to defend the Europe cybersecurity. We have our Microsoft Cloud for Sovereignty. We provide a lot of photography capabilities that prevent us from even being able to see individuals' data, as well as keep data in the EU. So I think, and that's Microsoft, but I know other major tech providers are doing similar things. So I think we're trying to listen to the concerns of companies and policymakers and try to provide, the capabilities and controls that hopefully provide more trust and confidence and the ability to trust our solutions.
Awesome, thank you both. So we are coming up on time. Actually, we're about 5 minutes over, but the last debate was too interesting to cut us short. So if you want to read more about our global cyber policy trends that we're seeing, you can download with the QR code on the screen. I think links will be sent around afterwards for our edition 4 that was published 6 weeks or so ago. Equally, sign up for edition 5, which is coming next year, around looking again at kind of the policy trends that we're seeing and how that impacts organizations. The recording itself of today's webinar will be available on demand, so you can share it with all of your interested colleagues. We also have another webinar coming up on the state of supply chain security, which is obviously very relevant and also touches on that question that we just had in around digital sovereignty. So with that, I think it just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Christo. Thank you, Kevin. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Awesome. Goodbye.